Hello and welcome back to All About Plants, my talk show where I sit on my couch and make videos and you guys hopefully watch them. Are you guys watching these? Hope so. Anyways, today let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about vascular plant reproduction. So let's find out how ferns reproduce, how pine trees reproduce, how do apple trees reproduce. Find out after the break. Just kidding, there are no commercials. But I really should be selling ad time on these. Anyways, all vascular plants are sporophyte dominant, which, if you remember way back to Monday when we talked about moss reproduction, we talked about the sporophyte generation and the gametophyte generation. And moss, if you remember, are gametophyte dominant, which means that when you're looking at moss, you're looking at the gametophyte. But for vascular plants like ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, it is the opposite. When you look at a tree, you are looking at the sporophyte. When you look at a fern, you are looking at the sporophyte. When you look at a pine tree, I already said tree, you're looking at a sporophyte, not the gametophyte. So for vascular plants, the sporophyte is the dominant life stage, and so they grow up as a sporophyte and they live their whole life as a sporophyte. And then when they are reproducing, they make a teeny tiny little gametophyte that then makes the gametes. That then becomes a new sporophyte. So for vascular plants, the sporophyte is the actual plant itself, and the gametophyte is more often than not a teeny tiny microscopic little thing that they make just to produce gametes. So we are going to break it down by type of plant. So first we're going to talk about the pteridophytes, which are basically ferns. So we are talking about ferns, which are our simplest vascular plants. Remember, they are vascular, so they do have that circulatory tissue or the conductive tissue to move water and nutrients and stuff around their bodies. And they are fully developed plants, but they are the simplest vascular plants because they have no seeds. Ferns only use spores. So the fern itself is the sporophyte. If you remember, they've got their two life stages, the sporophyte and the gametophyte. The fern itself is the sporophyte. So this is a fern, more or less. Kind of. Okay. Anyways, so this is a fern. And if you look on the underside of a fern's frond, you will see these little dots like this. These are called sporangia, and they are basically clusters of spores. So these spores form on the underside of the fern frond, and then when they have grown to their full spore form, they are released into the wind. Goodbye, spores. I hope you find some moist, beautiful ground to grow on. So if they do land on that moist, beautiful ground, that spore will grow into the gametophyte, because remember, quick review, the sporophyte makes spores. The spores grow into gametophytes. The gametophytes make gametes. The gametes grow into sporophytes. So they basically make the seeds of each other, if that makes sense. So, but they're not seeds, technically. So, not yet. So the sporophyte, which is the fern itself, makes the spores, which grow on the underside of the fern frond. They are released into the wind. Then they make their way to nice moist soil, and there they grow into the gametophyte, which is a teeny tiny little thing. So the gametophyte has both male and female reproductive parts in the same system, so the same little plant. If it is moist enough, the male part will fertilize the female part. Fertilization occurs, sexual reproduction occurs, which results in a diploid zygote, which then will grow into our sporophyte, which is our fern. So that is the simplest of the vascular plant reproduction, and it is only going to get more complicated from here. So hold on to your couch or wherever you are in your home, because now we're talking about gymnosperms. Woo! So our gymnosperms are our pine trees and other conifers and other things that are related to them. So how do they reproduce? With seeds. So ferns have no seeds. Gymnosperms and angiosperms use seeds. So you've got, with conifers, you've always got a, stop blowing up my phone, y'all. So you've got a pine cone. This is a really good pine cone. Yes, I know. I don't really know how to, there we go, right? So yeah, that's it. That's a pine cone. Looks kind of like a pineapple, but close enough. So this is a pine cone. A pine cone is actually the female part of their reproductive system. So pine cones are females, which yes, is weird to think about, but they are. So you've got the female cone. I'm gonna erase this weird line in there. So you've got the female cone that has eggs on it, right? Because that's the female reproductive organ, would be the egg. So they're like little tiny ovules, basically, which is the female reproductive structure, and they are exposed on the outside of the pine cone scales. So kind of like at the base of each scale, you've got a little teeny tiny female ovule. So these are our female ovules. They're not that big and visible in real life, but they are exposed on the outside. Remember, gymnosperms are exposed seeds. I think it literally means naked seed, gymnosperm does. So these are their naked seeds, the female ovules on the outside of the cone scales. And then you have the male cone, which is, if you look at a pine tree and you see those like little like squishy cones, like the green ones that like just grow on the end of a pine tree branch, those are the male cones. So they've got these little squishy male cones. I don't know how to draw that. That's good enough. So you've got the little squishy green male cone with that produces the pollen, which is kind of like plant sperm. So this produces pollen. This is the male cone. Produces pollen that is then taken away by the wind or the water or whoever, and the pollen makes its way to the female ovule on the outside of the cone, fertilizes it, and it becomes a seed. Once it is a seed, it kind of like moves inside, sort of like it's on the inside of the pine cone. So when this whole pine cone is full of fertilized seeds and they are grown and ready to be released, the female cone will open up and release the seeds, and they'll be taken by the wind and the water, and they will find a new place to grow and develop into a full pine tree. So that is how gymnosperm reproduction works. So they produce their sperm and their egg in their individual cones. They eventually find one another, but they have to rely on like wind or water to get them there. So the pollen won't just, they don't have pollinators like angiosperms. So they rely on the wind to, by chance, take the pollen to the female cone and fertilize it. So that is gymnosperm reproduction. So the, again, the pine tree itself, the conifer, the tree, or whatever itself, is the sporophyte. So the entire plant is the sporophyte. The gametophytes are only teeny structures like the ovum inside, the ovules on the outside of the female cone, and the male structure that creates pollen, which is on the end of the male cone. So those are the gametophytes, the teeny tiny structures on the outside of the cones, and the actual sporophyte itself is the entire tree. So for angiosperms, it's very similar in that the entire plant is the angiosperm, and there are just teeny tiny little structures that make up the gametophyte. So angiosperms have no cones. They instead have fruits and flowers. So any fruit you think of or any flowering plant you think of is an angiosperm. So wildflowers and most trees that we think of are all angiosperms. So they do not need the wind to carry their pollen to the ovule because they have pollinators, because they have flowers. So pollination is a super cool evolutionary crazy thing that happened, and that allowed them to be able to reproduce so much more efficiently because they don't just have to dump all their pollen into the wind and hope it like meets up with an egg and fertilizes it and turns into a plant. Instead, they rely on pollinators. So this includes bees, wasps, some flies, some birds like hummingbirds, even bats. So pollinators are not just bees, they're a ton of different things. So they are attracted to the color of the flower and, they get food in exchange. So that's a mutualistic relationship, right? So this is, it likely arose out of co-evolution, which we talked about a little bit when we talked about symbiotic relationships. So that is when two species impact each other's evolutionary tracks. So we believe that pollinators and angiosperms kind of evolved together to form this relationship. So our pollinators move the pollen from one flower to the ovum of another flower, and then fertilization occurs. So the ovule will swell, the wall will toughen to protect the seed, and the ovary turns into a fruit. A fruit is technically anything that covers up a seed of an angiosperm. So a lot of things are fruit that we don't really think of as fruits. So any food with a seed inside of it is technically a fruit, right? Anyways, so let's talk about flowers. So the entire plant is the sporophyte again, and the flowers are still a part of the sporophyte, but they make gametophytes. So let's talk about the parts of a flower. So down here is the stem, and it grows bloop bloop, and you've got these little green things down here that are called sepals. The sepals used to cover up the bud that became the flower, so they opened up and released the flower from the bud, but they're still there. They're not leaves, they're sepals, and now they're just kind of chilling. So those are the sepals, and then boop, doo-doo. So this is the female structure of the flower. It's a little wonky. That's okay. So in here you've got the ovary. So this is the ovary, blah, blah, blah. This is connected to the ovary. This is the style, the long neck of the female reproductive part. And then this is the stigma. So that's where the pollen needs to land to travel down the style to get to the ovary. Where is the pollen? Let's find out. So this is the female part, the ovary, the style, and the stigma. The male part, which is called the stamen, is made up of two parts. You've got filaments, which are these long tubey guys. They would be on both sides, but I ran out of room over there, so they're just going to be over here. We've got the filament, and then at the top, we've got the anther. So the anther and the filament make up the stamen, which is the male part of the flower. And then on the outside of the flower are the beautiful petals, which the purpose of is to attract pollinators. I promise in the notes I have a much better picture. Look how beautiful that is. Yeah. So look at your notes, print them off, love them, cherish them, because this is ugly. But these are the parts of the flower. So you've got the female parts and the male parts in the same flower. But in order for genetic diversity to happen, we need not one flower's male parts to fertilize their female parts, but we need them to mix with other flowers of different trees. And that's where the pollinator comes in. So your buzzy bee comes in here and comes to get his food, and he rubs a little bit of pollen on him, and he's super cute. And then he flies off and goes to the next plant, to the next flower, where he drops off a little piece of pollen. It enters the style from the stigma, So it goes from the stigma to the style, down this tube into the ovary, fertilizes the egg. So the egg is now a zygote, and the ovary, which is this whole thing, grows into the fruit. So it kind of hardens around the seed and protects it. So that is how plants reproduce. Fascinating. The miracle of life, right? So this concludes our video lecture series, sadly. So I will see you guys on Google Hangouts, hopefully, if you choose to join those. If not, no worries. Remember, you've got the notes online, you've got questions that go with those notes, and you've got your plant photo assignment. So get working on those. Shoot me an email, a Schoology message, or Google Hangout message if you need anything, if you got any questions. Feel free to reach out. It's my job. So I would love to answer your questions. I'll see y'all on the other side of the whole situation, not like afterlife.